testing your psychic abilities to see if you could pick up the gist of the conversation without actually hearing it. No, actually, we just had internet connection. So for all of those that stuck it out, we're continuing with Swami Abhedananada, and he says here, there is no such thing as dead matter. And so that reminds me of, we had a gentleman here years ago named John Dobson, who talked a lot about science and Vedanta. And one thing he pointed out was that matter has sentiency built into it. We usually think that we're sophisticated living beings, that we have sense organs that see things and hear things, and we can sense gravity, and we can we can taste things, and we can feel heat, energy, and so forth. But when you think about it, the reason our sense organs can do all those things is that the atoms themselves do those things. The atoms respond to photons, and so they're molecules in our eyes which can respond to photons, and we then interpret that as seeing, and so forth with each of the different energy sources. He gave a lecture in Chicago once on matter as sentiency, and after being widely questioned and criticized by the majority of the audience, he said, I know, you think you're all very sophisticated beings because you know where down is. But if you really want to know where down is, you hang an insentient piece of lead on an insentient string, and then you know exactly where down is. And he said the whole audience was dead quiet. They knew they'd been had. So there really is something to this idea. And we were trying to remember which direct disciple said it, but one of them, I think it was Brahmananda, says, in the response to some question, said, show me the demarcation where matter ends and spirit begins. And of course, that's, we look at science and we find all these fuzzy distinctions that it's very difficult to define what life is and what matter is, and you end up with these kind of in-between things like viruses that you can't quite say are alive and you can't quite say they're dead, and you don't quite know where to put them. So this idea of what life is, how it started, and what makes it different from everything else is a very knotty problem. It's not at all solved. The other idea here is this idea of this oneness and this eternal life principle that's manifesting itself through the entire creation. This again was described by John Dobson. He talked about how the reality is Brahman, infinite, undivided, and unchanging. And so what we see in this world through this veil of Maya is just the opposite. We see everything is divided up. We see it as all finite and is all changing. So you would expect that there would be this driving force back to what it really is. In other words, it wants to be undivided. We see it as divided. It wants to be undivided. We see it as finite, it wants to be infinite, and we see it as changing, and it wants to be unchanging. And so that's why we seek for peace, that's the unchanging nature. That's why we seek for love, that's the undivided nature. And that's why we seek for freedom, that's the infinite nature. And so it's because that's our true nature that's not being clearly manifested. The whole game of Maya is this game trying to get back and express that perfection which is in us. And so that's exactly what Swami Abhedananada is pointing out here. All right, why don't you continue, Amma?
Vedanta points out that aim of human life is perfection. Then as we approach nearer to perfection, the ways of our living become better and better and better. And by experience, we come to know that the best way of living is not to follow the dictates of a narrow and limited will, but to obey the universal will. We start at first with a tiny little, weak, and thin thread of will, which grows stronger and stronger as we rise higher and higher in the scale of our life. Then gradually, by passing through different stages of manifestations, we gain more and more experience and begin to see how the thread of the individual will is connected with the universal will, and slowly understand their relation, and ultimately realize that our will, which we have so long thought to be ours, is not ours, but a part and parcel of that one universal will, which is moving the universe from the minutest atom to the biggest solar system. And our bodies are nothing but so many small instruments through which that all-pervading will is expressing itself. But as long as we do not realize this and think that our will is a separate will and is not related to the universal will, we believe that by following our imperfect will, we shall gain the highest benefit. But the result is suffering, misery, and sorrow, which we experience in our everyday life. This idea of separation or mistaken notion makes us think that we are free, while in fact we are bound hand in hand, foot, like a slave. And consequently, we do not seek freedom. How can we seek freedom when we do not know that we're bound? First of all, we shall have to examine our own nature, whether we are free or bound, and then we can search for liberation if we really need it. Very few indeed in this world can realize that we are living the life of a slave. Amongst those who can understand it, very few can get freedom from that dreadful drudgery of a slave. But the majority delude themselves by thinking that they are free. Consequently, they like their present condition and do not care for any other. Very few indeed in this world can realize that we are living the life of a slave. Amongst those who can understand it, very few can get freedom from that dreadful drudgery of a slave, but the majority delude themselves by thinking that they are free. Consequently, they like their present condition and do not care for any other. It's very curious to notice that those who are born and brought up as slaves and live constantly in the society of slaves will rather die there than become free citizens.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of some of the modern movie themes where, well, in fact, I think wasn't there a Twilight Zone episode where a man finds himself on an alien planet or something, and they treat him very nicely and give him all these wonderful accommodations, and he thinks, oh, this is so nice, they're being so nice. And he's very happy until he discovers that what he's really in is an alien zoo, and he's a specimen in this zoo. And then he's not so happy. Or like the, what was it, the Truman story, where they raised this kid on an artificial island, and make him think that that's his whole world, and they build into him a fear of water, and so he doesn't want to cross the water and find out what's across the water. And so he's pretty happy there, but he eventually starts seeing little clues that there's got to be more to things than this little island, and there's something peculiar is going on. And then he bursts out of this artificial environment and finds that there's a whole other world there. So that's kind of the condition that Swami Abhedananada is describing here. We think that this world is pretty nice and handy-dandy until we realize that we're really are slaves of our sense organs. We have to remember that we need to be the one in charge and not let the sense organs be in charge. And so it's that kind of freedom that we need to realize that we need to strive for. Or it's like Alice in Wonderland, is, you know, she thinks everything is fine until the Red Queen's about to chop off her head. Then she realizes she's got to get out of this, and she realizes all she has to do is wake up from her delusion. So it's all that kind of metaphor that's very similar. Can you think of any other movies or something? I don't know. I'm sure there's several that are like that. Is the Matrix like that, or they're trying to break out of the Matrix and that sort of thing? Yeah. All right, but it's interesting that there are hints of this idea coming through in the popular film genres. Why don't we go ahead?
If any one of such slaves fortunately get the idea of freedom and try to acquire it, then his fellow slaves will think that he's going in a wrong way and will try their best not to allow him to get out of their community. But if his desire for freedom be extremely strong, he will never be dominated by the influences of other slaves around him, but will seek the company of such as are free and not bound by the chains of thraldom, and have wiped out the mark of slavery from their forehead. Then perhaps he will come to help those who want to be free. The community we are now living in is exactly like that of slaves. We are born as slaves, brought up as slaves, and live amongst slaves. If we look around, it will be almost impossible to find a man or a woman who is truly free. If any person gets the idea of freedom in his mind, tries to attain it, our first duty will be to find fault with the ideas of that man or dissuade him from following his ideal. Are we not slaves to our own desires, own passions, and own senses? Are we not slaves to our own body and to the changes that are constantly going on in the machinery which we call the human body? Are we not slaves of anger, hatred, jealousy, emotion, pain, or sense enjoyments? Are we not consistently obeying the commands of hundreds of such masters that are ruling within us? Well, if anybody utters sweet words or expressions, well, we feel ourselves flattered and elated, and how we feel insulted, wounded, or hurt when any harsh word enters our ears. Is it not slavery? As long as we are seeking pleasures, are we not slaves of the desires for pleasures? Are we not slaves of insatiable greed for wealth and of ambition for social and political power, name, and fame? What could be worse than such a state? But how amazing it is to notice that although we are slaves of desires and passions, slaves of pleasures, comfort, and luxury, slaves of ambition, pride, and vanity, slaves of beauty, which is skin deep, slaves of sweet words, anger, and hatred, slaves of body and sense enjoyment, slaves of life, death, and everything, yet we do not feel it and are not conscious of it. But still we never think of any other condition better than this. In fact, we are sleeping unconsciously after drinking, as it were, the cup of the frightfully intoxicating liquor of self-delusion. The whole humanity is madly pursuing the phantoms of hope, which change their color as we come nearer and which suddenly disappear, and after a moment appear at a distance with new brilliance and fresh colors that attract our attention again and force us to chase them again and again and drag us headlong in that breathless pursuit. This process is continuously going on in each individual life. Really, we have made ourselves slaves of delusion and also slaves of the phantoms of hope. How can we have happiness under such conditions? How can a slave become happy? He may delude himself by thinking that he's happy, but after all, it is not happiness. It is a delusion. Happiness does not consist in slavery, but in freedom. He who is free is truly happy. That happiness, which comes through freedom, is unbounded and eternal, If we want that unbounded and eternal happiness, we shall have to become free and shall have to break down the chain of slavery. And before we become emancipated, we must have to know and to be conscious of the fact that we are at present in bondage. The moment we come to know that we are living like slaves, the moment we begin to see the real conditions of our present life and existence, that very moment we begin to feel the effects of slavery in our everyday life. And then we seek the company of those that are free and have broken the chains. Then we appreciate their sayings. Then we understand their meanings. And if we follow their instructions, we gradually become free as they are. From that time, we remain no longer slaves of passions, desires, and senses, but we gain mastery over them. We control them, and we are free and have broken the chains. Then we appreciate their savings, then their meanings, and if we follow their instructions, we gradually become free as they are. And from that time, we remain no longer slaves of passions, desires, and senses, but we gain mastery over them. We control them, and we conquer them. All passions and desires can no longer bind us, but they remain as our slaves. This freedom from constant slavery, or the emancipation of the soul from the bondage of delusion, is the highest ideal of Vedanta. It is called in Sanskrit moksha, which means liberation or freedom. Vedanta does not go on speculating, theorizing and theorizing like other philosophies, but it starts by taking the present conditions of our lives as they are. And then it shows the way of it by removing the cause.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, so I'll just make a quick closing comment. You can see this idea of freedom in action in someone like Swami Vivekananda, who knew he was one with the infinite. And he didn't let public opinion and just detractors bother him. And he was equally happy in very simple accommodations or literally being out on the street, and in very palatial accommodations by very rich people. It didn't matter to him. He was equally comfortable in either place. So that's because he was always identified with his infinite nature, and what other people were saying, whether it was good or bad, did not affect him. He was not moved by that. And isn't there a story about the mosquito, and the mosquito lands on the horn of the bull or something, and the bull says, "Oh, of course, bring your whole family. I don't care," because the bull is big and it's not bothered by little things like mosquitoes. So we have to be like that. The little mosquitoes of life's societal pressures need not worry us. We need to identify with our true self. Did they have a character called Public Opinion in Offenbach's Orpheus in the Underworld? I think they actually made Public Opinion a character in the show that was always causing problems because people were being driven by this person called Public Opinion. So that's what we need to remember. The more we can cultivate that identity with our infinite self, the less we will be troubled by the little petty things of this world. Sorry for the technical difficulties, and thank you to all of you who stuck through it all, and I hope it was worthwhile. We'll close with a chant. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Peace, peace, peace.